We're very, we're very honored this weekend to have David Eby with us, who is the overall director of music in Ananda, and he's been doing a weekend of workshops and rehearsals with our choir, which have always been wonderful, but you notice this morning they have gone even to a higher level, and we're very grateful for that. David's the one who's been playing the cello for us also. It's amazing to me. I've been listening to those songs for so many years, and yet you'll hear them. I'm not in the choir, but I can sing every word, and I know all the melodies, and it's all I can do back in the back, not to sort of play karaoke and just be going along with it. Because it's just, you don't know what to do with yourself. It's so beautiful. You want to have some way of expressing it. And it doesn't make any difference that it's familiar. In fact, in certain ways, it's because it's familiar. It's sort of interesting. There's this illusion in the mind that inspiration comes from variety. Whereas, in fact, there's a timelessness to true inspiration. That's why Master added, when he described cosmic Satchidananda, ever existing, ever conscious, and then he used the phrase, ever new joy. Because otherwise you can think, well, it's just going to be the same old joy day after day. And the human mind thinks that we have to be stimulated from the outside or we'll become discontent. But that concept of ever new joy is just a fascinating one. And it partly has to do with this quality of timelessness, to be able to just stand in the center of reality at all times. I think I've shared with you Swami Kriyananda in this book he's written for adolescents, The Time Tunnel. And he talks about time not being linear but circular, that past, present, and future exist in a circle with the center point of being eternal now. So wherever we're standing, we are equally in relation to the past and to the future, but where we stand is in the now. And that's why great souls who are completely without any oscillation in their consciousness, nothing draws them out of this exact moment, then in this exact moment they can access everything that ever was and ever will be. It's impossible to articulate it in words. It's an experience that can't be described, although Paramahansa Yogananda's poem Samadhi came very close, which are the words that you see on the wall and the whole poem in the back. But still, it's something that we sense. Swami Kriyananda tells the story of his own life of being a very small child. And when he was born with such a strong awareness of higher states of consciousness. As he put it, his childhood was a state of, as he put it, constant surprise to be in this world at all. And the material world to him, he said, for most of his young years, was not that real to him. It was sort of a dim reflection, and there was a consciousness of an inner world that was much more real. And he talks about things he did as a child that would move him more into that world. His mother had a prism mirror on her dressing table, and he would stand, probably when he was just the height of the prism mirror, and he would just look into that prism, and then there would be rainbow worlds, as he put it, revealed to him. And somehow those rainbow worlds seemed much more real than the dull world he was looking at. Or he took a blanket, a colored blanket, and spread it over a table, and then went and sat inside of it so that when you looked through, you were looking at all this colored light. And when he would fall asleep at night, this great light would appear to him. And that light, that light would expand and expand until he was completely absorbed in it. And he thought that's how everyone went to sleep. He was much older before he realized that was his own unique experience. But here's the element that's so interesting. Then at the age of 9, physical illness struck. He had delirium through fever, and he became, as he put, wary of any abnormal states. He also became old enough to realize that his perception of the world was not shared by others. I think all of us can sort of remember coming out of childhood and beginning to realize that what we just so naively assumed was the truth about everything is not exactly how that is. Whether that comes at the age of 9 or 39, at some point, there comes a point where we begin to see what is, in a sense, really going on here. Well, Swamiji, at the age of 9, as he put it, he felt the need to try to adjust to the world as he found it. And he repudiated, to a certain extent, those inner states of consciousness and didn't come back to them until he became a disciple of Yogananda. And so at the age of 22, he became Yogananda's disciple and he started practicing Kriya. And then he modestly describes, and in my practice, I entered into a state of super consciousness. And the interesting part is, he said he immediately recognized it as the same place he'd gone to as a child. And then he said, and no time had passed, because in that state of super consciousness, it's always the eternal now. So from living on the circumference of all these seemingly sequential events, when he went back into the now, he saw that everything is happening simultaneously around him, that no time had actually passed. Now, all of this is telling us that in the most modest sense, this world is not what it seems. Isn't that so? I've just come back from several days visiting the only remaining relatives I have of the generation before me. I have an uncle, my father's older brother. He's 96 now. And I didn't really know him growing up, but somehow in these later years of his life, I've become karmically connected to him. I think partly he's drawing on me. He doesn't approve at all of what I'm doing. In fact, he's extremely cynical, and it's only because he's not in his right mind anymore that he doesn't become so unpleasant that, as I explained on Mother's Day, I would have to renounce him and just walk away. Oddly enough, and this is the odd thing, his conscious mind is really quite scornful of what I do, although interestingly, in his own 20s and 30s, he had a spiritual interest, and then something really soured him on it. As elderly as he is, that was very unusual at that time. It was based on the Rosicrucians and the Vedanta Society, but he totally repudiated it all. But now at the end of his life, when his extremely powerful intellect is no longer functioning, and he seems to be going much more on instinct, in this most peculiar way, he really likes me. And even though he spends his time doing things like wrapping up crackers in pieces of paper and writing crackers on the pieces of paper, so he's not like who he used to be, he says things to me like, "You're the only person I can still learn from." Isn't that interesting? I was just so struck by that. And then he also remarked very cogently, "You've really charted your own course in life and it's worked for you. I admire that." But all of this is the soul coming back, basically, to where it started. Just because the intellect is not interfering as much. My father also, his younger brother, in the last few years of his life, also became, I don't think it was really Alzheimer's, but it was age-related dementia. That's the lovely phrase they have for it. My father, who was also a brilliant man, used to be very nervous about many things, but when he started losing his fundamental mental capacities, he forgot what he was so tense about. And he became just very childlike and absolutely dear. He just became extremely sweet. And it's so fascinating to me. I like to visit them, my elderly relatives now, because it's so salutary to me. It sort of stiffens my spine and reminds me, first of all, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. I see young people walking around, as Ananta put it. Ananta last summer spoke to Spiritual Renewal Week at the village, and he said to the young people, "Oh, you better use those beautiful young bodies while they're still working well." He said like that. It doesn't feel like that when you're in a beautiful young body and it's still working well, but sooner or later it just does what it does. And it doesn't really have anything to do with us. It really literally ages around us, and we move through in the eternal now. I mean, that circle is repeated. Spirit is center everywhere. Just as the great cosmic time circles around the eternal now, so the great egoic experience circles around the heart of spirit within us. When we meditate, we go deep into the spine. That's what we teach. sit up straight, look upward, feel your consciousness at the spiritual eye, withdraw from this outer world, turn off the sense telephones, as Master calls them, so that nothing can get through, and then we just live in that inner consciousness for a time. St. Paul said, I die daily. And of course, he didn't physically die, because there he was again after he was finished meditating, but he meant, I withdraw from this ever-circulating past, present, and future, and I live only in the eternal now. Nothing exists. I live in eternity for that moment. And so our bodies age around us, our minds age around us. You know, my uncle there's nothing wrong with him. As soon as he figures out that he doesn't have to stay in that body, as soon as whatever this karma is done, you know, his soul will exit. His soul he doesn't have age-related dementia on a soul level. It's just literally his little brain doesn't work anymore. And so it just feeds him the oddest signals, but there's nothing wrong with him. When my father died, I was sitting next to him, and I felt such an overwhelming sense of joy. It just, in the moment that he breathed his last, just shooting up my spine like this, that I could hardly stop laughing and smiling. I was just so elated. And I really felt it was him, just saying, oh, look, I'm out of there. That poor old broken machine. Swamiji described when his father died, and his father died also in his mid-80s, and the last year or two of his father's life was very frustrating for him because, you know, he had a heart attack, and instead of just peacefully letting him leave the body, they called the paramedics and brought him back. So he got to have, you know, another terrible year. But right after he died, Swamiji described, Swami was up at Ananda Village, and he died here in Atherton is where he was living, San Mateo. Menlo Park, I mean. It was San Mateo Avenue, so I always say it was San Mateo. It was Menlo Park. And Swamiji said, as the moment his father died, or right at that time, his father died on Shivaratri, interestingly, very auspiciously, a very holy occasion. His father didn't know it was Shivaratri. But Swamiji said he suddenly felt his father as he had been as a young man, with all that vitality and vigor and positive energy and creativity and courage that had characterized him, that had been shrunken up by this shriveled little body and this demented mind or injured, weak brain. But nothing had happened to him. Now, this is the challenge of our life at all times, that nothing ever really happens to us, in the sense that we exist always the same. Anandamoyi Ma, great woman saint of India who lived to be 82 and was recognized, died in 1982, she was in her 80s, and she was discovered, found to be a great, was a Jivan Mukta, Master said, and she was recognized as a great spiritual being at a very young age, and had a very feminine ministry, in the sense that she was in a woman's body and she had that feminine energy in this sense, which is she never built institutions, she never built temples, she never founded organizations, she never really did anything. She just simply existed as this radiant beam of divine light, and she was mother to everyone, and hundreds of thousands of people all throughout India and all throughout the world became deeply devoted to her, but all she ever did was exist in this state of infinite bliss. Swamiji said, interestingly, even though her mission was feminine, her consciousness was very masculine. She was a very small woman and very beautiful, but he said when she marched, you know, the floor sort of shook. She would walk with so much strength. And her philosophy, and most of what you read of her, is very impersonal. She had a very masculine-oriented way of expressing the philosophy. She was motherly in her love, but she was somewhat masculine in her mind. It's all very Vedantic. It's all very, all is one. And she worshipped Krishna too, so she was everything. But the end of all of this is in Autobiography of a Yogi, when Master says, tell me something about your life. You know, he met her and was obviously drawn to her enormously. They were old karmic friends. Tell me about your life. So she describes, I was a young girl, and then I was married, and then I came to this place, and then this happened, and this happened. And she described about 5 different circumstances. But each time she described a condition, she said, I was always the same. I was married, I was unmarried, I was young, I was old, my husband died, I became a widow, I lived here, I lived there, I was always the same. I had a collection of photographs of her once in front of me, and they ranged from when she was very young, an extraordinarily beautiful young woman, to very old with all of the wrinkles and the things that happen to the poor body as it hangs around for a while and begins to get worn out. And I just, for the fun of it, I just took my hands like this and just sort of isolated down to just this much. And indeed, she was always the same. You know, every picture of her, she was always the same. Because the inner consciousness held on to that single reality. You know, this is not something that necessarily comes to us just all at once. You know, this is the fruit of spiritual practice. This is what we do. We become inspired with the idea that this is possible. Some part of us, either by faith or experience or intuition, who knows. I was intrigued recently to hear Swami Kriyananda speaking of spiritual experiences, and he mentioned some people see the spiritual eye. They see the gold and the blue and the white star. They look right into it. He said others see it with intuition. Isn't that an interesting way to say it? That they may never actually see it in physical form, but it's as if they see it because they know it's there. And I know so many people on our particular spiritual path, meaning the path of Kriya, the path of Ananda, the path of Paramhansa Yogananda, we're not given to a lot of bells and whistles. You know, it's not a path in which there's always phenomenal things happening. It's not everybody coming in and telling about this experience and that experience and this vision and that vision. It's just not the way our particular path manifests. But there is this intuitive conviction that I know so many of you feel, that this is a true path, and this is a path that if I follow, it will bring me everything that my heart is longing for. Because even in our reading today, when the Bhagavad Gita says, sit alone, sequestered in a silent place, consciousness withdrawn, still it says, you have to find a path that resonates with your vibration, and then you have to follow it sincerely. You know, I stand now, there is some advantage to age. In fact, there's enormous advantage to age, even though it's totally an illusion. In the sense that, you know, how old are we anyway? We're the same as Swamiji says, we're as old as God. We were created when creation was made, and our little egos have been struggling through this game for a really long time. And just because you're 6 or 8 years old or 21 years old, you're no more 21 than you are 96. You know, we're just living through these bodies. And sometimes the body is young and sometimes the body is old, and there's certain influences that happen because of it, but it's never who we are. But there's this pleasant reality of being able to remember sections of what you've done with more than intuition. You know, I know many of us, and I count myself among it, were just born with this. At first I didn't know what it was, but this driving desire to find my spiritual path and my spiritual family. I was well raised in a comfortable place by kindly people with a great deal of integrity, but I mean, what planet am I on and how did I get here? And is there any place here that really is going to make a little more sense than this? I can remember just staring out the window in this house we particularly lived in. I can just see the houses across the street because I just looked out that window and I kept thinking, there's something so completely wrong with this picture. And I wasn't sophisticated enough to know what it was, but it was just, there is a reality behind this, and why can't I see it? So then it crosses our minds that there is a reality behind the obvious reality, and I want to see it. And we begin this process, which is called spiritual practice. It has many elements to it. It has prayer, it has meditation, it has selfless service, it has relating to our brothers and sisters on the spiritual path. But it's a very simple process, really. It's a moment-by-moment battle between the forces within us, the side of us that wants to just say, oh, it's really not worth it. I'm just going to do what everybody else is doing. Why not? You know, I'll just worry about money, and I'll worry about clothes, and I'll worry about what I eat, and I'll worry about what the neighbors think, and I'll just live this ordinary life, and I'll be nice, but not too nice, and I'll gossip, and, you know, all the things that everybody does. Or we decide, no, that's not enough for me. I'm going to be very, 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 very different than that. Because intuitively we know. Because you see, it's always now. And so every postponement of that commitment to right consciousness just commits us to wrong consciousness. More suffering, that's all. And we fight the good fight day after day. As Yogananda said, you should plant yourself and fight the battle for joy right where you're standing. Yes, sometimes we get to move a little bit. Sometimes we get to move off of this spot into another spot. Sometimes the whole world will rearrange itself. Sometimes all our circumstances are either blown up by our own hand or blown up by somebody else's hand. I mean, these things just happen over and over again, but we fight the battle for joy right where we're standing. And we listen to what the masters tell us. What is right attitude? What is asked of me? And we don't just rebel against it. We don't just say, no, I want it to be otherwise. You know, I want it to be otherwise. They have this program at Ananda Village on their major blog at the worldwide Ananda site. It's called Ask the Experts. And a question was submitted which got sent to me. And this woman is basically saying, she was talking about the Adam and Eve story. It was a very good question, actually. And what she essentially said is, you know, isn't there a way just to have lots and lots of sex just for pleasure? Why must it always be tied to having children? And I wrote her back and I said, well, what you're asking is, can we separate physical action from physical consequences? I said, can we just eat cream puffs, you know, and still win the Boston Marathon? Can we just never practice the piano and still become a great musician? Not likely. You know, they're just physical laws. And, you know, God didn't try to punish us by this sort of thing. It's just, this is the way the world is. And we go through the stage, which is called the revolt. Every week in the Festival of Light, we read that little story. And some of you may listen carefully. Some of you may tune it out. I have to pay attention because I'm reading it, you know. You've seen what happens when we tune out. Oh, you know, all of a sudden we're just lost. I pay attention very carefully, even though I read it every week. Because every week I hear it and it speaks to me. This bird is sent out on this divine mission. God says, you are a part of all that is. Be fruitful, be multiply, and share whatever you have. Meaning, don't commit yourself to this little tiny ego. You think it's so much fun, but it is really not as much fun as you think it is. You know, your real happiness comes from embracing the infinite, which is your true nature. And the little bird gets out there and he begins to feel his own power. He begins to find the pleasure of this and the pleasure of that. Oh, look how my body pleases me. Look how everybody thinks I'm wonderful. Look what fun it is to get for myself. And so the little bird simply declares, oh, I think that the infinite was wrong. I think creation is not really what it seems. And then this wonderful line, what else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? You know, often in Ananda we joke about wrong attitudes we might be tempted to have. That's a line I love to quote. When I see a cheesecake on the table and I just pick it up and say, what else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? You know, it's your own words, Swamiji. That's why I get to do it, right? Even the devil can quote the scripture, right? So the bird just gets to declare it. The bird just gets to say, oh, this is really true. This is the truth. And so the bird then just goes out, thinking first about himself and his own pleasures, and this is what I want, and I'm going to separate pleasure from its consequences. I'm going to eat nothing but cream puffs, and I'm still going to win the Boston Marathon. And then he doesn't. And he's so puzzled. You know, he's so puzzled. Gee, what happened? Maybe I need different shoes. So he reincarnates again to get a different pair of shoes, because he's making a self-declared reality. And then this poor little bird, and even though repeatedly he lost everything he had, still he clung to this idea. Doesn't that sound embarrassingly familiar? You know, this bird's brief day was like eons of our time, right? Where we just keep playing it out over and over and over and over and over again until finally this thought crosses our mind. The first thought is not revelation. The first thought is, gee, maybe I need to try to understand instead of just declaring. So then we move from revolt into the stage which is called the quest, which is a huge shift. Because what that says is, what is going on here? You know, where does my happiness come from? And I'm tired of suffering. And you know, that change doesn't come 1 second before you're ready to have it happen. But there just reaches a point where you're just tired of suffering. We are enough tired of suffering that the challenge of change seems less painful to us than continuing as we are. And that's what we have to cultivate in ourselves over and over and over again. Gee, I don't really think this is working. I don't think this is working. Let's try to remember, and let's go on the quest. And then we just ask, what are the consequences of my actions? And what can I do to bring about what I want? Because no matter how much we think it's not going to happen, we're always going to be standing right now. I sit there watching my uncle wrap up his crackers and write 6 crackers, you know, with 4 rubber bands and put them carefully aside. And I see, set on the other side of the table, this bagel enshrined. You know, this bagel enshrined with all these notes. It says, do not touch, which he described to me as the symbol of some contract that he has with someone. You know, it all makes perfect sense to him. His poor brain isn't working. He's just putting things together. And actually, if you listen carefully, you can often feel what it is inside of him that he's trying to say. And because I lived through this with my father, I also sort of, I don't know what's happening. Is it this? Anyway, am I okay? Because I lived through this with my father, I also was, I watched my father lose the capacity to know which words to use. And he would more or less use words randomly. And he would use the words that he still remembered. He was an actuary and a mathematician, and at one point he'd sold insurance. So we would have conversations about benefits and policies and things like that. But I knew he was trying to say something completely else. He just didn't know what the words were anymore. You know, because his consciousness wasn't damaged, just his ability to say it. But I look at my uncle and I think, you are your consciousness, that's all. Doesn't really make any difference, because to speak of people like this, Kamala Silva, who was a great disciple of Master, also became, her brain completely went away at the end. And she just didn't have any intellectual faculty. But her consciousness was just radiant. And she was living in some little facility somewhere. Her family took her away from Ananda. We were taking care of her, and then they put her in this facility. It wasn't a very pleasant place. She thought she was in the Himalayas. She thought all of her stuffed animals were living toys, living animals. She was very fond of animals. She thought she was surrounded by pets. She had all these stuffed animals. She thought they were all living animals. Who's to say they weren't? She was in a state of total bliss. You know, who cares anymore? Because it never really happened anyway. All that ever happens is our inner consciousness. You know, all I can say, it's very simple, and Swamiji emphasizes this. The wonderful thing about this path is it isn't that there's nothing and then there's everything. It's that every step you take in the direction of God brings you more and more bliss. What the Bhagavad Gita says, even a little practice of this inward religion frees us from dire fears and colossal sufferings. Even a little practice. You know, just moving ourselves in the direction of God brings God rushing to us. And the state of that relationship, Sat Chit Ananda, ever existence, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss.